International development is a complex global effort that faces daunting coordination problems. International development arose from two trends that mark the history of the past 2 centuries. First is the great divergence of incomes per capita across the regions of the world. In 1820, the richest country in the world, probably the Netherlands, was about 4 times richer than the poorest country in the world. Now, the difference between the richest and poorest country is more than 100 to 1. At the same time, the number of sovereign states went from less than 50 back in 1945 to more than 200 today. This means that while before the differences in incomes happened within large multi-ethnic empires like the British or the French, today it involves different sovereign states. As a consequence, delivering development assistance now involves crossing borders, and this requires international institutions. In the early days, a few institutions were created, such as the Red Cross, the United Nations, and the Bretton Woods institutions. But over the course of time, many more were created, including those created by individual rich country governments, the so-called bilateral institutions like USAID or DFID, while many private foundations emerged to lend their hand. As a consequence, the field now involves hundreds of donors. Development assistance also started with few topics, centered around infrastructure, education, and health. But then it moved into others, adding issues of industrial development, trade, human rights, environmental protection, gender equality, governance, and many more. So, more countries, more donors, and more issues have made international development much more complex. How would you go about coordinating this effort? Suppose you try to match one country with one donor agency to work on one issue. You would have several 100,000 possible combinations. Now suppose you wanted to involve 2 aid agencies instead of 1. You would have then tens of millions of possible combinations. And if it were 3 agencies you tried to coordinate, you would have billions of possible combinations. How would you go about coordinating all organizations and all countries to work on all issues? So far, we have tried to organize this process using hierarchies, just like a modern corporation or an army. The current de jure approach requires countries to first agree on the Millennium Development Goals that they are supposed to follow. Then an individual country is supposed to write a poverty reduction strategy paper consistent with the Millennium Development Goals. Then they are supposed to convene roundtables or consultative groups to allocate tasks among donor agencies. On the internet, you can literally find millions of documents produced for these groups. But such hierarchical structures become very cumbersome as the number of entities involved and the issues to be addressed increase in number. Instead, a more networked structure can allow the system to self-organize without a hierarchical command structure. Willing donors and willing recipients can coordinate on goals that they both share, without the need for all donors and recipients to agree on the same goals for all countries, as the MDGs currently require them to do. And that's where the Aid Explorer comes into play. We built a system that transforms speech on the web into information that can facilitate matching countries with aid agencies that share their interests. We look at how frequently aid agencies talk about each other, about each country, and about each issue. We also look at how frequently countries talk about the different issues. So what can you do with the Aid Explorer? Let's consider Bolivia. Suppose you wanted to support micro-enterprises in Bolivia. You would want to know which aid agencies care about Bolivia and which agencies care about micro-enterprises. Hopefully, you could find one that cares about both. With the Aid Explorer, you can generate more than 25,000 such graphs. But this may be too detailed for some uses. With the Aid Explorer, you can relate any aid organization or development issue with a country. and see at a glance whether the agencies that care about the country also care about the issues that the country cares about. Good job, International Cooperation and Development Fund. You can aggregate the information over all of Bolivia's issues. For Bolivia, microenterprise is one example that works. The organizations that care about Bolivia also care about microenterprise. But apparently, nobody is focused on creating jobs in Bolivia. You can rank organizations in terms of how well they match the priorities of the countries they work with. You can rank countries in terms of how well they are matched with agencies that share their priorities. And Bolivia is not doing that great, actually. And how able is the international community to coordinate on different issues, highlighting some tough ones, especially those related to economic growth? The Bolivia story and 1,000 more are just a click away in the Aid Explorer website. We hope you will find it useful to improve on the current state of aid coordination.